Hello everyone, I'm Onursal Bagirgan. It's a weird Turkish name and surname. And I'm going to present today my job market paper, Repeated Tax Amnesties. First of all, thank you for inviting me here. Hopefully I will talk a little bit about my paper and we are going to have a nice discussion. So today's presentation will be about tax amnesties, as you might guess from the title. And I'm going to focus on the fact that they are recurring events. And then I'm going to introduce a theory which basically studies the dynamics of tax amnesties. And through this, it can explain some stylized facts that I can see in the data. So let's start with some facts from the data. I have a sample of tax amnesties from 1982 to 2018 for US state-level tax amnesties. Most of the things that I'm going to talk about today also applies to country levels and different tax amnesty data, but for the sake of following a story throughout the paper, I'm just going to talk about this sample of US state-level tax amnesties. So the first thing that we should realize is that tax amnesty, in terms of tax amnesty implementation, states vary enormously. So there are some states that in the map, if you see the darkest color is means that that state has 6 or more amnesties throughout my sample. And the white color means that that state doesn't have any amnesty throughout the sample. So the first thing we should get away is that there's a big heterogeneity even among the states of one big federal country. But this is just a cross-sectional difference. So since I have a data which covers almost 4 decades, we should also look at the time dimension. When we look at the time dimension, we actually see interesting patterns. So we can categorize these US states into 4 different categories. One is no amnesty states, which basically means that states do not have any amnesty throughout these 4 decades. The second category I call rare amnesty states, which basically average very few amnesties. I have 1 or 2 amnesties throughout the whole sample. Third category I call frequent amnesty states, which basically, these are the states which has 1 amnesty in every decade, and they frequently declaring amnesties more frequently and repeatedly compared to the other 2 groups. And there is this fourth group that I call regime-shifting states, which are the most interesting ones. These are the states that at the beginning of the sample, if you look at them, they behave like this no amnesty or rare amnesty states. They do not declare amnesties almost at all or once in 20 years. But through time, at some point, they start to declare amnesties very frequently and very repeatedly, as much as these frequent amnesty states. So these are the 2 things that we are going to get from the data. One is heterogeneity. The other one is some states sort of change their regime in terms of their attitude towards tax amnesties. And this paper is about answering the questions related to these facts that we see from the data. I try to answer why do some governments implement tax amnesties repeatedly and frequently while others don't. So this addresses the heterogeneity. And also, why did some governments that rarely implemented tax amnesties begin to use them repeatedly after a certain point? While trying to answer this question with my tax amnesties model, I actually realized the main mechanism which can answer both of these questions, which can bring an explanation to both of these questions. So I'm going to introduce this main mechanism of the paper, and I think the story will be clearer after this. So think about a government that tries to decide whether to declare an amnesty or not. Okay? So if you declare an amnesty as a government, you would collect some extra revenue for the government budget, and which is good. But declaring an amnesty may come with some other things as well. Particularly, declaring an amnesty might be a signal of weakness in terms of how willing the government is to enforce tax law. Because if you are a government which declares amnesty, you might seem as a government which is soft on tax evasion. And if people believe that this softness may persist in the near future, actually this may have some consequences for the future. So basically, if a government declares an amnesty, it might make taxpayers to expect another amnesty in the near future if they believe that the softness of the government will persist. If government doesn't declare an amnesty, then there's no alteration of expectations in this regard. But then what happens if taxpayers expect an amnesty in the near future? One natural behavior of taxpayers is to start to evade more. Because if I'm a taxpayer, and if I am almost sure that there will be a tax amnesty in the near future, I would like to hide my income or sales or whatever the thing that I have that I need to pay taxes, so that I can declare this income through the tax amnesty period and pay less taxes. Because from the data we see that governments always put a lot of discounts during the tax amnesty periods. But if taxpayers believe this and start to evade more, the total tax evasion gets really high. If total tax evasion is high, then there is more benefit from declaring an amnesty from the government side, because now you can collect even more money through the tax amnesty. Then this creates extra incentive for government to declare a further amnesty in the future. But then this ensures the expectation of taxpayers about the softness of the government. Then we can make this whole loop again and again and again. So the main result is that it is possible for just one amnesty to trigger a sequence of further amnesties in the near future. And this might explain the regime shifting states that we see in the US state level data.
So Onursal, when we set up the program like this, what I would be really interested in is two different aspects. You show us different states for the US. It would be interesting to understand if there are different ideological backgrounds to this. So what is the governor during that period? Is it left or is it right?
So I'm going to talk about that, but it looks like the governing party, Republican or Democrat, doesn't change the tax amnesty behavior. If anything, actually, without making any estimation with empirical methods, if you just look at the data, you see that democratic-leaning states have more amnesties, actually, which is a little bit more surprising than, because initially people would expect Republican governments to be soft on tax evasion, right? But I'm going to talk about this after the model.
That's very good. And then the second would be, at that point in time, the government will be looking at some form of tax gap.
Yes.
Do we have any idea what is the gap? And then do we have any idea about the quantity of that's coming in through the amnesty? Because this gives us an idea of the decision as of time t. Because now we look backwards, it's easy for us to come to different conclusions. But what's important is, looking there, was there a consistent gap in taxation? Was there perhaps an issue with the budget being closed through regular taxation? They didn't tax the markets. Was it a period of high interest rates? So what would be interesting is, what is the environment around the decision?
Okay, so let me introduce first what we know from the literature. Mm-hmm. Then I will talk about what I know from my studies while introducing my model. Okay. If there is no other question, I would like to go to the literature, because the tax amnesty literature goes around this cycle, but no one is able to put his or her finger on this whole loop. So the first paper, there are 4 papers which are very related to what I do here. First is this Ross and Backwalter paper, which attributes somewhere between 13 to 16% of tax amnesty revenues from strategic delinquency. By strategic delinquency, I mean that taxpayers expect an amnesty in the near future, and therefore they evade, and then they declare their income through the tax amnesty. And with a nice empirical study, actually, this paper is able to attribute more or less 15% of tax amnesty revenue from this channel. So it basically shows that if taxpayers expect an amnesty, then the amnesty benefit is really high. So this is one empirical evidence that we have. Second is Bayer, Oberhofer, and Wiener paper, which is very recent actually, they show almost a full cycle, apart from one implication. They show that expectation of amnesty, if an expectation of amnesty gets higher, then the probability of amnesty in that state also gets higher. The only implication we are missing here is the implication that if government declares an amnesty, it may alter the expectations. They don't say anything like that. That is the actual contribution that I'm going to make to the literature. There is a third paper by Allen, Mackey, and Beck, which is very old, and it's actually an experimental economics paper, which is very interesting at that time. And they do an experiment of tax evasion, lab experiment of tax evasion and tax amnesties. And they see that the first amnesty that they offer to taxpayers actually increase the tax evasion, the total tax evasion. And lastly, Dominika Langenmeyer showed this by using US federal government data. She shows that the 2009 federal government tax amnesty that US federal government put actually increased the tax evasion, the federal government tax evasion, federal tax evasion in United States. Even though the program ended at 2009, the evasion was higher in 2010, 2011, 2012. So this too shows the implication that when government declares an amnesty, it actually increases the evasion in the near future. So now I'm going to combine all of these.
How do you measure this tax evasion?
So the Langenmeyer study does the following. It looks at the US economy in 2007, 2008, so before the tax amnesty implementation, and it creates a synthetic analysis. It combines some other countries and a combination of Canada and I don't remember the other countries, but let's say Switzerland and Norway, represents well the US economy in terms of tax revenues. Then US declares a tax amnesty in 2009, but all these other countries, which creates the synthetic US, didn't declare any. Then she compares the tax revenue of the synthetic United States compared to the real United States. If there's no other question, I will just briefly show you the further related literature, which is on tax amnesties, or my paper also relates a lot to government policies with lack of commitment and time inconsistency. I'm not going to be able to talk about time inconsistency in this presentation because of time limitation, but if we have time, I have some backup slides to show as well. So, at this point, what I'm going to do is the following. I'm going to introduce the whole model, but then I'm going to first solve a one-period version of the model and then go to the dynamic version. So the theoretical framework is as follows. It is basically a game between a government and a continuum of taxpayers. And it's an infinite horizon setup. One simplification I introduced to be able to make it tractable is that taxpayers are short-lived. So they're born in a period, they pay taxes or evade taxes, they live that period, they consume whatever they have, and then they die. And the next period we have new taxpayers. The interesting part is more the government type. Government is a long-run player, and it can be of two types. It can either be a no amnesty type, which never declares any amnesty by just principle. So it's a behavioral type. Or it can be an opportunistic type. It may declare an amnesty if it maximizes the discounted sum of total revenues. And this government type is private, and it can evolve with a Markov process. So the taxpayers know that government can be of these two types, and they know about the Markov process, but they don't know, they are not able to observe the government type in a given period. They're going to induce information from the tax amnesty behavior of the government. So, it's a little bit of a loaded model, so I'm going to go slow in the timing part. So let's talk about the timing in a period T. So at the beginning of the period, each taxpayer I draws an income and a preference parameter from two known distributions. Distributions are known by the government, but these two variables are the private information of the individual. So I might draw an income W, and you might draw an income 0. We don't know each other's income, and government doesn't know. But government knows the total amount of individuals which should draw W and total amount of individuals which should draw 0. The same applies to preference parameter. This preference parameter is to capture the idiosyncratic differences among taxpayers about how willing they are to evade taxes. I might have some psychological cost of evading taxes because I believe that I should be a rightful, truthful person. But another person might even enjoy evading taxes from the government, right? So this preference parameter is to capture these differences.
So income, there are only two states, either 0 or W?
Yes, either you have income or not.
But then it's a binomial, right? Distribution, if it's only two states, it's not uniform.
It's a discrete uniform, which is
okay.
Exactly binomial, yes. So after drawing income and preference parameters, taxpayers declare an income, and based on the declared income, they are paying taxes with a given tax rate tau. Then, after the government collects taxes, the government decides whether there will be an amnesty or not, and I represent that decision with this variable x, which can be anything between 0 and 1, so I allow government to play a mixed strategy as well. But the older results hold if I don't allow mixed strategy too. And in case of declaring amnesty, government needs to pay a fixed cost of declaring amnesty, CA, which represents some non-monetary cost that government may face by declaring amnesty that I may not capture simply in amount. If government declares an amnesty, it also decides endogenously about how much discount it is going to put on the tax rate. The initial tax rate tau is a is a parameter, but this AT is a choice variable of the government. Then, given whether there is an amnesty or not, and what is the special amnesty tax rate, the taxpayers will decide whether to participate to an amnesty or not. And if you participate and declare your income in the amnesty period, you need to pay your taxes based on the tax amnesty tax rate. And at the end of the period, if there are still taxpayers who still hide their income, they can get caught with probability P, and if they get caught, they're going to lose all their income to the government. So as you can see, I try to simplify the income part and the tax evasion penalty part as simple as possible, but I endogenize the tax amnesty part as much as possible as well.
So I have some question on these choices.
Yeah.
Usually the government might decide that, this goes back to my initial question, the government decides whether they want to do the amnesty or not if they believe two things. One, that there is a lot of income that's out there undeclared. So this parameter on the government side is actually a function of the expected or perceived W distribution in the population. So, or better said, YD in the population. The government, if I'm the government and I believe a large fraction of the population evades taxes, and I believe the amnesty might bring money back to the government, I will do that. But if I believe everybody is doing that honestly, then I as a government don't have much of an incentive to do that.
Yes, exactly.
So that's one of the decision variable for the government's function. The second is, do I really need the money? Because I'm pretty sure that everybody thinks in the same way you presented. If I declare the amnesty, I kick in this expectation of further amnesty, so I damage my own reputation. Why would I do the amnesty? Because borrowing is too expensive, and I actually need the money. So these choices might actually, these three things might actually be relatively important in driving the decision of the government.
Yes, and in the model it will be.
Okay, good.
Okay.
And may I add one more dimension to that question, actually the third dimension. why does the government need, I mean, does the government consider that it does need an amnesty and rather than recourse into a regular way of doing things, because the government normally does have an enforcement mechanism. Well, where is the borderline between the government deciding, all right, I cannot rely anymore on my usual means of enforcement and have to apply to amnesty, where it is? I appreciate it may not be model related.
Well, actually, I think it is model related. So you're basically saying that the government, the probability that an evader can get caught, P,
Yes.
is high in an economy. There are less incentives for government to declare an amnesty, right? This is what you're saying. If government has the ability to enforce, more or less, the tax collection, then compared to a government which does not have any enforcement tool, that government has less incentives to declare an amnesty. And we are going to see that at the equilibrium.
Agree. My question actually was, I mean, what should be the indicators for the government to think that, all right, I'm not getting enough of tax collections, when the red light should go on for the government, and the government has to start believing that there are, immense amount of wealth hiding out there.
Yeah, so I try to capture that and also the borrowing part all together inside this fixed cost of declaring amnesty. I promised I was not gonna use the laser, but the fixed cost of amnesty tries to capture that. If the fixed cost of amnesty, so there is a cost and benefit of tax amnesties that I'm not able to capture with this model. There might be some political costs, or maybe we are in a recession that I really need money as the government, right? In that case, you can interpret that if I really need money as the government, this CA goes really to really low values compared to the times that if I don't need any money, then this cost is really high because the political cost side dominates the picture, then the CA might be really high. So actually I have an extension which I try to introduce recessions in a sense by playing with this cost. I understand that it doesn't capture exactly what you are asking, but we can talk about this at that extension. If I have time, I will talk about that.
That actually answers my questions completely, because the government has to report to the amnesty, as I understand it, when it badly needs money and has no other means, another sources where to get money, or it is motivated by some political reasons, which is fair enough. That's a good point.
Yes. So that was the decisions of government and taxpayers in a given period, but all those decisions are actually a function of the expectation of taxpayers, as I said at the beginning. Because, as I said, if you really expect an amnesty inside this period, you might evade taxes so that you can declare your income throughout the amnesty time. So there are some variables which is going to affect the expectations of these taxpayers. So ROTI is basically the probability that the government is the opportunistic type. So if this probability is higher, it means that this probability is basically an upper bound to probability of an amnesty, because we know that the other type never declares an amnesty. So if this ROTI is 0, we are not going to see an amnesty in this period for sure, right? So this is sort of capturing the reputation of the government. Then, given this, each taxpayer will form a belief about the probability of amnesty, and given its income and preference parameter and this belief, the taxpayers will decide whether to declare an amnesty, whether to declare their income at the beginning of the period or not. Then the whole game will be played, as I just showed, and at the end of the period, taxpayers may update their beliefs on the government type, given whether they see a tax amnesty in this period or not. If they expect an opportunistic government to declare an amnesty for sure in this period, but then if they don't see an amnesty, it means that the government is actually the no amnesty type, right? So the taxpayers are rational. Even though they are not able to observe directly the government type, they can infer information from the game which is played inside the period. So this is the whole model. Before going and solving the whole dynamic model, which is a little bit cumbersome, I will first focus on a one-period game like this, and I will take this rho t as given, and there will not be a second period, and I'm going to solve that model first, then we are going to go to the dynamic version. So this is actually, we can skip in a short time, but let's look at the payoff values of the taxpayers and the opportunistic government. So the taxpayer have an income y. If it declares yd at the beginning of the period, it pays a tax multiplied by the tax rate tau. Then with probability phi t, there will be an amnesty, and the expected income, if there is an amnesty, is different than the expected income if there is no amnesty. So the taxpayers induce all these information in their payoff function, and they're going to decide based on this. Then the opportunistic government basically maximizes the total sum of revenues. This is one period revenue. Of course, this is the one period objective function. When we go to the dynamic version, the government's decision will be a dynamic decision, right? Forward-looking decision.
So can I ask you a quick question here? So the cost of hiding income after an amnesty is basically what you are losing. No, what you're losing because you would have paid less had it been an amnesty.
So cost of hiding income after an amnesty is basically if you still hide your income. Mm-hmm. So this, because of the simplicity of the initial distribution, 0 and W, mm-hmm. if you hide your income, you hide all your income.
Ah, okay, it's all W.
Yes, because if you declare you had income W over 2, you already reveal that you are lying because there's no income W over 2, right? Okay. So all the people who drove 0 will declare 0 for sure. There are no incentive to deviate. Mm-hmm. And all the people who draw W either declare W or 0.
Okay.
So that simplifies this analysis a lot. Now, when we are looking at this, it looks a little bit complicated. But yeah, basically, if you hide your income, even after an amnesty, then you are gonna, with probability P, you are gonna get caught and lose your income. Mm-hmm. Plus, you have this psychological cost of being an evader at the end. Okay. Epsilon I represents that, and P represents the probability of getting caught. And the thing inside parentheses will be either 0 or W based on whether you declared your income or not.
Because the government knows exactly there is 0 W, but they don't know the time, right?
Yes, so what government knows is that which ratio of the whole population draw W and which ratio of the whole population declared W. So they can guess which ratio of the population is evading. But they are not able to say that, okay, you're an evader, you're an evader, you're not an evader. They cannot do that. So let's go to the one period version. We are going to take the government reputation as a parameter. And this one period model, still, it's an extensive form game. So we are going to solve it backward induction to satisfy the sequential reasoning. So there are three stages inside a period. First, taxpayer's initial income declaration, evasion decision. Then government will decide whether to declare an amnesty or not, and if it declares an amnesty, it's going to put a special amnesty tax rate. And in the end, if there is an amnesty, the tax evaders will decide whether to participate in the amnesty or not. So what I'm going to impose here is that, which is very important for the results, is the rational expectations assumption. I'm going to assume that the initial belief about the probability of amnesty will be the actual probability of amnesty at the equilibrium at the end of the game. So the probability of amnesty that these individuals expect at the beginning of the period should be the probability of amnesty that opportunistic government declares times the probability that government is opportunistic. And since I enforce these rational expectations, everyone should have the same belief about tax amnesty. Right? Because rho and x star are not individual specific. If this is clear, I want to go further. If you want to ask a question, I'm happy to answer, because this is an important part. From here, we are just solving maximization problems, and they are extremely simple with backward induction. First, we are looking at the tax evaders problem. if there is an amnesty, they decide whether to participate or not. And only the people who draw W would consider whether to participate or not. And there will be a threshold value of epsilon, which I represent with epsilon lower bar. If your epsilon is lower than that, you do not participate. If it is higher than that, and if you are an evader still, you participate. So by solving this, we can impose the result of this to the previous stage, and we can solve the government's optimal amnesty tax rate. In case government declares an amnesty, there is a unique maximum which maximizes the government's total tax revenues. And it depends on the cutoff value of taxpayers at the beginning, whether they evade taxes or not. So at the beginning of the period, basically, if you're a truthful taxpayer, and if you draw W, you pay taxes with tau times W, and this is your income in the end, and you're going to consume this. If you're not truthful, and if you evade, from the payoff function, we can derive this whole expected income that you can have. And then, basically, there will be one taxpayer which is indifferent between being truthful or being evader. And that taxpayer will be the cutoff taxpayer. If your psychological cost of evasion is higher than that cutoff value, you are not going to evade and you are going to be truthful. If you are not so concerned about being an evader, so if your cutoff value is lower than this, you are going to lie and you are going to be an evader at the beginning of the period. And these are just simple solving maximization problems, but these are the payoffs and incentives that plays inside the period. So given this whole maximization problems and the optimal decisions, actually we can derive 3 different functions for the government, and for the rest of the presentation I'm going to use these 3 functions. So all the things that we did in this one period game is actually to be able to derive these 3 functions. A is basically the total government revenues for the period if government declares an amnesty. R is the total revenues if government doesn't declare an amnesty. And the difference between these two should be the potential benefit of an amnesty. So government will look at this and decide whether the costs are higher than the benefit or not. And this benefit I represent with B, and it has a very particular functional form with the parameters that we have. So government declares an amnesty if this B value, benefit of amnesty, is higher than the cost of the amnesty. So this is more or less the question that I was getting from you too. And in the end, the rational expectations require the expectations should be consistent with the outcome of the game. So then this one period model have 3 cases with different equilibrium. One is that it might be possible that cost is so high that whatever the initial belief about tax amnesty of the taxpayers, the benefit will be lower than the total cost. Then no one would expect an amnesty in this period. So the only rational beliefs that taxpayers can form is to set the probability of amnesty to 0. And this is the unique equilibrium in this case. There is the reverse case where if benefit of amnesty is going to be higher than the cost, no matter how much, what is the probability of tax amnesty that taxpayers believe, then they are going to be sure that an opportunistic government will declare amnesty for sure. And this is the reverse case. And then there is an intermediate region where the benefit of amnesty may pass above the cost based on what was the initial belief about tax amnesty in the economy. So if taxpayers believe that there won't be an amnesty in this period, they are evading very little, then the benefit of amnesty is small compared to the cost. If taxpayers at the beginning of the period believes that an opportunistic government would declare an amnesty for sure, then they will evade a lot, then the potential benefit will be higher than the cost, and then the government will declare an amnesty. So there are multiple self-fulfilling equilibria in the tax amnesty environment. And we are going to exploit this in the dynamic game. So the main takeaway here is basically that there are multiple self-fulfilling equilibria, and the initial expectation of a tax amnesty may actually cause governments to decide a tax amnesty at the end of a period. Right? So this is the result from the one period game. I have further results, but I think I'm not going to have time to discuss those. So I will go to the dynamic model right away. So as you can see, from one period model, we are missing just one implication that I showed at the beginning. So from the dynamic game, we are going to get that. So in the dynamic version, you know the model that I just introduced you. Taxpayers are short-lived, so their problem will be exactly the same as in the one period version.
I have a quick question here. So the implication would be, given this multiple equilibria, that it actually makes sense for the government to declare a strategy and commit to it.
Yes, so it was one of the results that I hide inside one of these buttons.
Okay.
So if we are in that intermediate region, actually an opportunistic government would like to commit to not declaring an amnesty if there is a commitment technology.
So it started to sound very much like a central bank committing to an inflation target.
Exactly.
And then trying as good as possible to go to it so you don't end up in the multiple equilibria with very high inflation.
Yes, a very similar story goes in the monetary economic side, right? If government cannot commit to low inflation, then we might end up in a high inflation case because it is also self-fulfilling. If people expect high inflation, then at the end of the period we might see high inflation because of the expectations. There are very similar models in the monetary economic side as well. Actually, if I have time, I'm going to talk about one of the extensions that I have, which is very similar to Barrow-Gordon, seminal Barrow-Gordon paper. Yeah, so it is a very similar story like that, but this is the fiscal policy side, let's say. So the taxpayer side is static because they are short-lived. From the government side, again, no amnesty type doesn't decide anything because it's just going to go like taxes and never declares amnesty by just principle. The opportunistic type now has a dynamic problem because previously the opportunistic type was comparing the benefit of amnesty with the fixed cost of declaring amnesty. Now on the cost side, there will be the reputational cost. If you declare an amnesty, you actually reveal that you are the opportunistic type. And this may have consequences on the tax revenues in the future. So the dynamic model will bring this aspect of the game. The beliefs of the taxpayers will be updated by bias rule, which is a very standard assumption. And I'm going to focus on the Markov perfect equilibria. Markov perfect equilibria is basically the equilibrium where the decisions of taxpayers and the government based on the state variable. So I'm not going to allow complicated history-dependent strategies of the government. It is just a simplification and equilibrium selection mechanism, actually. And it is very standard. In this kind of models, nowadays, we always focus on Markov perfect equilibria. So, before going to the main result, I'm going to introduce only one assumption. And I'm going to say that the benefit of amnesty, if there is no reputational cost, opportunistic government would declare amnesty for sure. Because I want to study the role of reputational cost on amnesty declaring decision. So this is the only assumption that I'm going to put on the parameters. Apart from this, all the results hold for anything else, basically. So what I'm going to do is the following. As you realize, even the one period model has multiple equilibria. So in the dynamic version, we are going to have infinitely many equilibria. What I'm going to do is, first I handpicked a Markov perfect equilibrium, I think, which shows the mechanism I would like to talk about a lot. It shows very clearly and in a clean way. And also it will show you that an equilibrium exists. Then I will go and show that actually the main mechanism that I just showed you implies in every Markov perfect equilibria that I have. So therefore, first I'm going to talk about an example Markov perfect equilibrium under these assumptions that we can have. But since we have multiple equilibria, an economy may end up in another equilibrium. We are going to talk about that later. So in this example Markov perfect equilibrium, we are going to have an equilibrium such as this. There will be a cutoff reputation value R, where if the probability that the government is opportunistic is less than R, then no one expects an amnesty and the government will not declare an amnesty. If the probability that we have an opportunistic government is higher than R, this threshold value, then everyone expects an amnesty from an opportunistic government. An opportunistic government declares an amnesty. So basically this proposition states that this is an equilibrium, and if you want to look at how does this look like in terms of the strategies, it looks like this. So this is the strategy of the opportunistic government. If the value of rho, so the x-axis is value of rho, and y-axis is this, the probability of declaring amnesty for the opportunistic government. If rho is smaller than R, the opportunistic government will not declare an amnesty. If rho is greater than R, it will declare an amnesty for sure. But this is the strategy of opportunistic government. Then we also have the probability that government is opportunistic. We should take that into account. So as an outside observer, actually this is the probability of an amnesty. So if rho is smaller than R, we know that none of the types will declare amnesty, so probability is 0. If rho is greater than R, then the opportunistic government will declare an amnesty for sure. And when rho gets higher, the probability that we have opportunistic government gets higher as well. So actually this is an increasing function of rho, right? The probability of amnesty. And it reaches its maximum value at the point that the maximum value that rho can get. So I'm going to talk about the dynamics on this graph. Let's say that the initial probability is 1 minus pi n, which means that government is most likely the no amnesty type. Okay? There's a value of rho star, which comes from the Bayesian update, that if we do not see any amnesty for infinite period of time, the reputation will converge to that rho star. Okay? So since we are below the threshold of R, we are not going to see an amnesty, but the reputation for the next period will get closer to rho star. Then in the next period, again, we get a little bit closer, but we are not going to see an amnesty. After a finite period of time, we should pass that threshold. And if we pass that threshold, now the probability of amnesty is positive, as you can see. It's somewhere between 0 and 1. If the government is opportunistic, it will declare an amnesty. And then everyone will realize that, in this period we have an opportunistic government. So the Bayesian rule will provide that the next period's probability that government is opportunistic is pi o. It's really high. Because government type was persistent from the Markov process. And if we see that the government is opportunistic this period for sure, it's most likely opportunistic next period as well. Then we are going to jump to pi o, which has the highest probability of amnesty at the equilibrium, which basically means the following. The probability of amnesty, it was a lot of talk, but the takeaway is very simple. When we see an amnesty, we jump to pi o. And pi o is the point that we point with the highest probability of amnesty. So the highest probability of amnesty reached after a period with amnesty realization, which is actually consistent with this main mechanism that I just showed you. When we see an amnesty in an economy, the probability of amnesty goes its maximum for the next period. Then if we see another amnesty, we are going to stay at that point until the government type changes from the Markov process. And that's basically it. So this is the simplest way to put the main mechanism and dynamics with a Markov perfect equilibrium. But as I said, this is just one equilibrium among infinitely many. Then I have a general result which basically proves that this mechanism holds for all Markov perfect equilibria that we can have. So it basically says the following. The probability of amnesty goes its maximum value in a period right after an amnesty. And this is the main theorem, well, I call it theorem, main proposition of the paper. So it shows two things. First, the mechanism that I showed you, this loop, exists in the equilibria. Also, it is very robust. It exists in every equilibria that we have, if we focus on the Markov perfect, of course. And this is the loop that we have, right? So let's go to the analysis of the results. So now I'm gonna talk a little bit about data, not much. This is very theory-oriented paper, but I would like my theoretical results to be consistent with the data as well. So basically, this highest probability of amnesty that we reach right after an amnesty is a function of W, tau, P, and Ca. If this ratio is higher, then the maximum probability of an amnesty gets higher as well. So it is easier to enter this loop. This is one of the implications of the model. Now I will try to check whether the data is consistent with this. Unfortunately, especially for US state level data, we don't have any idea about what is CA, so the fixed cost of declaring amnesty, and P, probability that an evader can get caught. So because of these limitations, I'm gonna assume that all these states are similar in these two aspects. And I'm gonna basically use W times tau square as an indicator of this whole function, because I can easily find data values to represent both W and tau. For W, I'm gonna use, if you remember, this was the income that people draw. So I'm gonna use personal income per capita for each state. And for tau, I'm gonna use the domestic tax burden in a given state, so that I can create this value for every state. And my model says that if this value gets higher, that economy should enter this loop in an easier way. So what I did was to order US states in terms of these values from the highest value to the lowest value. Then I compare the highest quartile with the lowest quartile, and I should see many more amnesties in the highest quartile compared to the lowest quartile. And this is the histograms of number of amnesties that we can have. Basically, the graph on your left-hand side is the lowest quartile. As you can see, there are 4 states, so the first column at the 0 represents that. There are 4 states in the lowest quartile which doesn't have any amnesty at all. And in total, we have 5 states without amnesty. And on average, they tend to declare less amnesties in the lowest quartile of these values. When we look at the highest quartile, we see that all the states in the highest quartile declared at least 1 amnesty, and they average much more compared to the lowest. So of course, this is not a particular estimation that I did with the data, but from looking at this, it looks like the model implications are consistent with the data implications that I can get.
So we have types of governments, and I was wondering about the first chart you showed us, no, the second chart with the time distribution of amnesties. One of the implications of the model is that if you declare now an amnesty, it's very likely you're going to have an amnesty next period.
Yeah.
And that's what we see in the 4th one. So when you go to the lower bound, there's always 2 black boxes, one next to each other, which means year by year, or what the time frame?
So it's not very easy to get a result in that sense, because based on the other characteristics of the economy, it might be possible that in one economy this cycle takes 2 years, while in another it takes 10 years.
Yes, but I mean in the one you showed us, basically it was the second graph.
Yes.
Where you have the white and black boxes.
Yes.
The 4th category was at least 2 subsequent amnesties. This one.
Yeah, so
So if
How
you
I
take-
created the fourth group is
Yeah.
that I divide the sample from exactly from the middle,
Okay.
and I look at how much amnesties they average in the first half of the sample compared to how much they average second half of the sample. And in the second half, they average as much as the frequent amnesty states, while in the first half they average even less than rare amnesty states. So that was the, but I didn't imply that they declare amnesties one right another or 7 years after another.
No, I understood that, but within the model says that if you end up with a government that gives an amnesty today, the taxpayer, presumes an amnesty next period.
Yes.
And that creates this doom loop for the government. You have no choice, you have to do another amnesty.
Yes.
And then what I see, for example, let's say Arizona or whatever is there, most of them have subsequent years of tax amnesty.
Yes.
So that is in line, even without having to do the quartile distribution and so on and so forth, that is lying there. And then if the second is true, the only way you can break the doom loop is if, for example, in 2003, you see that you have new government in place in 2004. So it would be interesting to see if following 1 or 2 amnesty years, the next year is an election year and the government changes. Because that would give you some form of empirical support to the fact that the government type needs to change in the mind of the observer. The only way that changes, if you have the same face, you're not going to believe it. But if it's election and a new guy comes and says, okay, clean slate, everybody pays taxes, those probabilities have to reset.
So, in terms of that, what I did was I tried to check first whether we see more or less amnesty. I didn't go as specific as this, to be honest, but what I checked was 2 different things. First, that I ran a panel probit estimation that I don't have in my slides because they do not look that robust, to be honest, the results. That whether having an election in the next year or whether having an election in the previous year affects the probability of amnesty in a given state. There is one of the papers in the literature actually looks at this, and they do not find any effect of the elections. That is the first thing. Second thing is that I try to look at whether Republican-oriented states have more amnesties compared to Democratic, or whether swing states have more amnesties compared to the more party affiliation states. And it looks like both does not matter. So even so this kind of characteristics of the government, the type of the government, you may think as more like a permanent characteristic, like it might be the efficiency or the people who work behind, even the governor changed, the people who work behind does not change much maybe. So they do persist. So that is the interpretation that I can say. So let's go to, so this is the 2 histograms that we compared, and we see that highest quartile ones have averaged more compared to the lowest quartile. And in the lowest quartile, we see many states without any amnesty, while in the highest quartile, there's no state without any amnesty. So then I run a simple OLS estimation, which I would say at the beginning, right away, that it's a bit problematic. But I just put it there because it goes in the direction of what I would like to say. But take it with a pinch of salt, because there are only 50 states, which means that I will have only 50 observations, which is problematic. But what I did here is I basically put number of amnesties for a state as the dependent variable. And for this personal income times tax rate squared, this particular variable that I try to examine as the explanatory variables, and I put some controls. And it looks like the results go in the direction that the model suggests. But as I said, there are only 50 states, which means there are only 50 observations, so take it with a pinch of salt. So there are a few extensions that I have. Well, I went faster than I expected. So because there are many questions about whether these results would be robust to some changes the assumptions that I have in the model. So I deviate from some of the assumptions that I have, and I try to find whether we see this loop with expectation traps in the slightly different models as well. So one thing I have is that I remove the Markov transition matrix. So government type is private, but it cannot change. These kind of models are very similar to Krebs and Wilson model that micro reputation literature builds on basically. And the Backus-Triffill model, which is again on monetary economics side, the inflation games. And it looks like we can create equilibria with this expectation trap loop in this kind of setup as well. Then I also have another extension with public permanent type. So now government can be of two types. And this type is observable by the taxpayers, and it cannot change. So suddenly there's no more private information. We can have this expectation traps, even in this setup, if we allow for history-dependent strategies. And this is basically this would basically be a very similar model of the Barrow-Gordon setup. So I'm not gonna go into detail of these two as long as you don't have any question. I will go to the stochastic cost version. So if you look at this, this is the number of amnesties when you sum up all the states in US throughout years. You see that there are some periods where we see more amnesties in total compared to the others. And coincidentally, it looks like these are the years right after recessions, because we have a recession in 2001 in US, then in 2008, we have one in 1982. So these peaks looks like they correspond to a few years after a recession. And it makes sense, because if we are in a recession, government really needs money, raise extra revenues, as you suggest. And tax amnesty might be a tool to be able to collect extra revenues. So how can I introduce this idea to the basic model that I have? So what I did was I introduced a stochastic shock to the cost of declaring an amnesty. Now cost can be either CL, which is low cost, or CA, which is the standard cost that we have. And at the beginning of every period, this cost is drawn, and it's public knowledge. So everyone sees if there is a recession. And I interpret the situation as, if there is a recession, which means that cost is low. So with some probability PL, the cost can be very low. And this rho is IID, which is an assumption to simplification. In this alternate setup, still we can have the interesting result that we have. So basically, this is just a formal way to write it, but how it's going to look like is the following. So if cost is low, CL is low enough, no matter the reputation is, the government declares an amnesty. Okay, we can set up an equilibrium like this. If cost is CA, so if cost is not low, then reputation plays a role. And we can basically construct this equilibrium. We see an amnesty if government reputation is at the worst value at pi o, and government does not declare any amnesty if reputation is something other than its worst value. So what happens here is actually the following. Let's say that the reputation is somewhere around rho star. So as long as the cost is CA, we are going to stay in that region, and we are not going to see any amnesty. But if at the beginning of a period we see a low cost, then the government will declare amnesty for sure, if it's opportunistic. But we are going to jump to pi o, and we are going to stay at that point. Thank you very much. We are going to stay at that point as long as government type persists. So this is an interesting result from the following sense. Cost goes down to a low cost for just one period, temporarily, and it recovers back to CA. But we see amnesties for many periods. So a temporary shock to the economy creates a persistent behavioral change on the tax amnesty declaration part. And this is basically the end of my presentation and last 5 seconds. So the data suggests that tax amnesties tend to be repetitive, and I came up with a theory which can explain the heterogeneity and regime shifts that we see in the data. If you allow me, I would like to talk about the future works for 20 seconds. So I think the main drawback of my model is that taxpayers are short-lived. So they're not able to save. They're not able to form expectations about the future periods. So a natural step forward from here would be to introduce such a setup. Because we see that many tax amnesties are happening now about not income taxes or sales taxes. Well, in state level, US state level, we see that. But on country level, we see more like tax amnesties on uncovered assets. Like you have assets in Switzerland and you didn't tell the government. But this, to be able to study those, which are, I think, very interesting, we should have a model which allows for capital accumulation, the saving, right? So that might be a natural next step. And I think Ukraine has a tax amnesty right now. This is what I saw in the news now, until the end of March. Okay, I'm gonna check that again then. Thank you very much for listening to me. This is Rosetta Stone, which has the first recorded tax amnesty in the history. So one takeaway. If you didn't like the paper, at least one takeaway that you can get from it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.